Hello, and welcome to session 4 of chapter 4 on tissues. And we are still talking about connective tissue. We went through and described the general characteristics of connective tissue, talked about the extracellular matrix, fibers, ground substance, all of those issues. Now we're going to do a survey of the various different types of connective tissue. And we'll also, I think, perhaps in this presentation, get into muscle tissue and perhaps nervous tissue. We might finish off the chapter with this presentation. We'll see how it goes and see how long this presentation is going to be. So as I said, we're going to continue with the survey of connective tissue. And I often like to kind of organize my thoughts when I'm tackling something with so many diverse views or so many diverse tissues. Try to organize that into some manner that makes sense to me. And so I'm going to outline the structure of connective tissue. And so let's take a look at this outline, then I'll explain what we're doing here. So I'm going to do literally in an outline form. So number 1 is going to be embryonic connective tissue. And under that, I'm going to have A, mesenchyme, and B, mucus connective tissue. And then I'm going to go here and I'm going to put in here mature connective tissue. And I'm going to have a loose connective tissue. And under that, I'm going to have 1 areolar connective tissue. Number 2, adipose connective tissue. And number 3, reticular connective tissue. Okay. And then I'm going to have a second category, dense connective tissue. And under this, I'm going to have the following categories. Number 1, dense regular connective tissue. And number 2, dense irregular connective tissue. Okay. And number 3, elastic connective tissue. And then I'm going to have C, and this will be cartilage. And I'll have under that number 1, hyaline cartilage. Number 2, fibrocartilage. And number 3, elastic cartilage. And then I'm going to have D here. And this is going to be a very loose category. I'm going to call it other. And under here, we're going to talk about bone tissue, blood, and lymph. Okay. So with this organization, I get a better sense of how these tissues relate to each other and what are the common threads that connect different types of connective tissue together. And it makes it easier for me to understand the entire group of tissues that we refer to as connective tissue. So let's just kind of break it down. So starting with embryonic connective tissue, obviously this is a type of connective tissue that's associated with the embryo, the developing human, and we are going to just briefly mention mucous connective tissue. We don't spend any time there. Mesenchymal tissue is something that we'll be running into quite a bit, even in the adult discussion of the adult body. So that we'll spend a little more time talking about. But all of these tissues, or both of these tissues, are all connected to the embryonic stage of human development. And then we get into mature connective tissue. And here the organization is, when we talk about loose, what I'm referring to is the density of fibers. So in these types of tissues, the density of fibers is not very great. So their fibers are present, but they're not in high concentrations. And that's what unites all three of these different types of tissues together. As opposed to, for example, dense connective tissue. Here, we're talking about a connective tissue that has a very high density of fibers. So dense regular, dense irregular, and then elastic. All three of these have a very high density of fibers. And we'll talk about what type of fibers and their arrangement later on. And then, of course, cartilage is a standalone category. There are 3 different types: hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. And then finally, the last category is kind of a grab bag that doesn't quite fit into anything in particular. So bone tissue, blood, and lymph, both of these are liquid forms of connective tissue, and that's a solid form of connective tissue. So coming back to this organization, one of the things I want you to see as you look at this and try to understand the connections here is that in many cases, what we're playing with is 2 variables. We're playing with different types of fibers and their concentrations and different types of ground substances. Let's focus on the fibers for the most part. So here we're talking about, in these 2 instances, collagen fibers, dense concentration of collagen fibers. Here the fibers are arranged in a regular pattern. They're parallel to each other. Here they're in an irregular pattern. This is also dense, but notice that we've changed the nature of the fiber. It's no longer collagen as we see in the first 2. It's elastic fibers. And this is going to give this tissue a considerably different functionality than these 2. As you recall, collagen is a strong fiber but has no elasticity to it. You can't stretch it, but it's very strong. This elastic fibers are just the opposite. They're strong, but you can stretch them. So we have a high density of fibers, but the fiber type is different. So here in these, we can pull on these without stretching that material. And so it makes for good connections, for example, between muscle and bone.
This, on the other hand, will stretch. It's strong, but it stretches. It's like rubber bands. If you put you encircle some object with a lot of rubber bands, that would be elastic connective tissue. So it's stretchable and it returns to its normal shape after pressure is relieved on the fibers. So here we're getting high density of fibers, and we can make different kinds of connective tissue by changing the type of fiber that we see in that connective tissue. Similar thing is happening here, although in this case, areolar connective tissue, we have a lot of fibers, but they're not very dense. And here we're going to change the type of fiber to a reticular fibers, and we're going to have a high density of the reticular fibers as opposed to collagen fibers and elastic fibers, but still the overall density will be low. So we're just changing the nature of the fibers. Here we get a combination of all three. Here we get a preponderance of reticular fibers, but again, it's not in high density. Adipose tissue fits in here because there are no fibers, and so I included it in this idea of loose connective tissue. Okay, cartilage is another example of how we can play with the density of fibers and the nature of those fibers. So here we also see a difference in the ground substance. So cartilage has a very particular type of ground substance as opposed to the ground substance we might find in areolar connective tissue, for example. So we're changing the ground substance and we're getting a different functionality there, but also we're changing the nature and density of fibers. So with hyaline cartilage, we get collagen fibers, we get some reticular fibers and other kinds of fibers, but not in high density. Here with fibrocartilage, we're going to increase the collagen dramatically, and we have very dense structure of collagen fibers in the same ground substance, but now a lot of fibers, and that gives us a very tough material. And then we have elastic cartilage. And again, we're changing the fiber and the density. So we go from low density to high density, and from all three different types of fibers to a lot of elastic fibers. And once again, the same ground substance, but we get a completely different type of cartilage here. Okay, so that kind of gives you a sense of how all of these connective tissues are related to one another, and the sort of the common thread. And it might help you to keep yourself organized in your head with all of these different types of connective tissues. So let's begin, and we're going to start with embryonic connective tissue. And we're going to start with mucus. Connective tissue. And we're just going to say that this is the umbilical cord. And that is all about what we're going to say about it. So let's see. We have an example of that. And this is mesenchymal. So here it is. And this is mucus connective tissue. And that's it. That's all we really need to know about it. It's the tissue that makes up the umbilical cord. Notice that we are going to cover that with epithelial tissue. That's one of the characteristics that we talked about earlier with connective tissue. It's often covered, and it's often covered by epithelial tissue, and the embryonic connective tissue is no exception to that. And we do have fibroblasts, so that's the immature cell in this connective tissue, okay? And we have a ground substance, and then, of course, fibers. Right. The second type of embryonic connective tissue is oh gosh, I'm sorry, is mesenchymal connective tissue.
And here we want to say a little bit more about this type of tissue. So it gives rise to all other types of connective tissue. Okay. That's mesenchymal connective tissue. It gives rise to all other types of connective tissue. And we'll come back and we'll talk about mesenchymal connective tissue, for example, when we see how bones are produced, how they're made. We start off with the embryonic form of connective tissue, mesenchymal connective tissue, and then we launch that onto a developmental pathway that will form bones eventually. Cartilage, the same thing. We'll begin with mesenchyme, and then that will transform into cartilage, and then in one form of bone construction, that cartilage then becomes bone. So a three-step process there. So mesenchyme is a type of connective tissue which is going to be something we'll run into a lot. And so let's take a look at that picture. So here it is, mesenchyme, and we've got reticular fibers, ground substance, and the mesenchymal cells. Okay, so this, notice we're not talking about fibroblast. We're talking about a mesenchymal cell. So this is, kind of think of this as a stem cell. This will give rise to osteoblast, it'll give rise to chondroblast, it'll give rise to a number of different cells, which then build very specific types of connective tissue. So this is the precursor cell to many of the cells that we're going to be talking about as we get into different types of connective tissue. So, and it's the kind of stem cell of all connective tissue cells. All right. Let's go ahead and let's begin with mature connective tissue. So the first category is going to be areolar connective tissue. And what we're going to find is that we have all three fiber types. With a random arrangement. Okay. We have several different cell types. And we have a semi-fluid ground substance. Some of the locations that we can identify for this type of tissue are a subcutaneous layer, which is deep to the skin. The lamina propria of a mucous membrane It's interesting that the textbook uses this terminology, lamina propria. Lamina propria is the same thing as the basement membrane. Now, there is some controversy, if that's the right word, in the field of study of basement membranes and tissues and so forth,
in that some people argue that the term lamina propria should be only used for very complex basement membranes. And if it's not a complex basement membrane, we use the word basement membrane by itself. I don't really care. We don't really care. As long as you understand that lamina propria is the same thing as a basement membrane, we'll be fine. And I'll just notice that the textbook introduces this term all of a sudden with, as far as I know, not any explanation. Lamina propria of the mucous membrane is the basement membrane of the mucous membrane. And maybe that's why they introduced it at this point, because they didn't want to say basement membrane of the mucous membrane. I don't know. But anyway, for those people that argue that this is a more complex form of the basement membrane, this certainly doesn't fit that definition, because the basement membrane of a mucous membrane, well, let me take that back. In some cases, it's very complex. So I guess it does actually fit that description here. Lamina propria for many mucous membranes, particularly in the digestive tract, is quite complex, which is probably why they actually use that term there. And also, by the way, surrounding body organs, blood vessels, and nerves. Okay. Its function is strength and support. Let's go ahead and take a look at a quick image here. So the image they're showing us is the subcutaneous layer. So this is the epidermis, and then from this squiggly line down to the blue is the dermis. So it's below the actual skin proper. Skin is composed of, as we'll see in the next chapter, the epidermis and then the dermis. So underneath there is a layer called the subcutaneous layer, and that is composed of areolar connective tissue. So this is something you should be familiar with, because this is one of the tissues we looked at in lab. Okay. So the next type of tissue then is adipose tissue. And here, of course, what we have is adipocytes. And they have triglycerides in them. So we storage that's the purpose of this tissue. Location, subcutaneous, layer that is deep to the skin, around the heart and the kidneys. Okay. Also yellow bone marrow. And this is something we'll be looking at and talking about when we do bones. So in the center of a long bone, the shaft part of the long bone, there's a hollow space, and that space is filled up with what is called yellow bone marrow, which is adipose tissue. Its functions are to reduce heat loss, storage of energy, support and protection. There is a special type of tissue that's called brown fat,
or adipose tissue called brown fat. And this is found in newborns. Okay. And it has a very rich blood supply. And a lot of mitochondria. And it's for the production of heat. So we've got everything that we need. We've got, with a rich blood supply, we got plenty of oxygen. With the brown fat, we have plenty of things to burn, and the mitochondria to go through the metabolic pathway and in production of heat. So one of the problems with newborn children, babies, is that they have a very small body mass relative to their surface area. So the smaller a mass you have, the ratio between the mass and surface area is surface area is greater than the volume. So the ratio between those changes as mass increases. As mass increases, surface area is reduced relative to the mass of that object. So the bigger you are, the less surface area you have per unit of mass. Okay? So babies are small, so they have more surface area per unit of mass. And that means that they have more surface area over which a smaller mass can lose heat. And so they're subject and sensitive to cold and heat loss. So one of the things that you might notice in animals in general, as if an animal lives in colder climates, then they tend to be bigger. And in fact, the same species, if the range of a particular species, mammals, for example, extends from warm areas up to cold areas, the species that are the specimens that you find in the colder areas tend to be larger than the same species in areas that are warmer. This is one of the reasons that whales got so big, is because they're dealing with a heat loss problem. So they have a very large mass, which means they have a larger mass per unit surface area, and that's much more easier for them to control their body temperatures. Okay, so that's adipose tissue. Let's take a look at that. And we've seen this, of course, in the lab. So we have our adipose cells here, and it's filled up with a great big droplet of triglycerides. And so this is typical for adipose tissue. In this case, they're showing us where it's located on the heart. Okay, so that's your adipose tissue. Reticular. So I believe this is number 3. This is going to be reticular connective tissue. Okay. And here, this is composed of a network of interlocking reticular fibers. Okay. And so if we were to draw, kind of a sketch out what this would look like, we get this kind of pattern. So we get this branching effect, and notice that they do end up connecting together to create a very complex sort of network. And with this kind of pattern, we get a lot of functionality. So we talk about forming the stroma of soft organs.
So if I have an organ and I want to maintain a particular shape, and most of the organ is composed of soft tissue, then I'm going to embed, let's say I have an organ that looks, I want to keep this shape in it. I'm going to then put this branching network of fibers in that soft tissue. Those fibers will arrange themselves to support that shape, and that shape will be maintained because of the support that these reticular fibers offer to the soft tissue. Okay. So this would be function, of course, forming the stroma of soft tissues. Also, it acts as a filter because in certain instances, and in particular lymph nodes, so once again, I'm going to draw another image here, and now I want to add some more information. Okay, so I'm not drawing this very well. You'll have to excuse me. So let me try to amend my ways here. There, that's better. Okay. So this is a lymph node, and what's happening is we're bringing in fluids. So lymph is coming into the lymph node from, in this case, 3 different sources. And lymph may contain bacteria or other pathogens that you have in your body. And then because of that network of reticular fibers that make up and keep the shape of the lymph node, we're going to place in that lymph node a series of cells that are part of the immune system. So we're going to fill this with cells of the immune system. And the reticular fibers are not just helping to filter the water, the fluid as it passes through, and direct it into compartments. So I haven't drawn this completely accurately. There are subcompartments within the lymph node, but as fluid flows in, it's being directed and slowed down by the reticular fibers. And the reticular fibers are offering a place to hold the cells of the immune system in place so they stay here. And so any bacteria that's passing through has a chance to come into contact with the cell that can recognize it, that's part of your immune system, and then you can respond to that pathogen. So it's going to be filtering that fluid and acting as a framework to hold cells. Okay. So forming the shape of the structure, offering a mechanism to filter, in this case, fluid, and also a framework for cells to attach themselves to, so they're not taken away in the current. Okay, so a supporting framework, the stroma, as it's referred to, holding the shape, filtering, and a place for cells to attach to. So it also, by the way, that the other function, so I have those 3 functions, and here's the 4th function. It's going to be binds, or it will bind, smooth muscle tissue together. So it binds smooth muscle tissue. So 1, 2, 3, 4 functions for reticular connective tissue. All right, well, let's take a look, see if we can get, perfect. So here is, in fact, the lymph node. Let me just zoom in on that so you can see a little bit better. So the dark lines represent the major compartments, but within these dark lines, you get these networks of fibers, and these are the cells of the immune system that you see here. They're all packed inside this lymph node. So fluid's coming in, And then the reticular fibers is going to slow the movement of that fluid, direct the movement of that fluid. So as it flows over the cells of the immune system, you have an opportunity to intercept any pathogen that might be in that fluid with a cell that's capable of recognizing that pathogen, and then you can start an immune response to that pathogen. So you get this kind of structure here with the fibers and the cells dispersed within the fibers. Okay, so that's your reticular connective tissue. So number 4 on our list then is going to be dense, regular connective tissue. And here we have collagen fibers. Dense bundles of collagen fibers. And they're all arranged in parallel. So we have a very strong tough material that resists pulling. So our locations are tendons, which is muscle to bone, ligaments, which is bone to bone, and aponeurosis, which is a sheet-like tendon. And its function, strong attachment. So strong attachment. Let's take a look at an image. So this is something that should be familiar to you. We have covered this in the lab. This is the so-called river of worms. So we have our fibroblasts, see, fibroblasts, meaning that's the immature form, and we have our collagen fibers, and they're all running parallel to each other. Okay, so this is a dense, regular connective tissue, and here we're showing it as a tendon. The next, number 5, is dense, irregular connective tissue. Dense, irregular connective tissue. Here we also have collagen fibers. And here we have a random arrangement. And so the fibers are not all running the same direction, and they're running crisscross to each other. So some locations is fascia, the reticular region of the dermis, and that's part of the skin. The periosteum of bone, this is a layer around bone tissue. The perichondrium, of cartilage. This is a layer around cartilage. Joint capsules, and the capsules around some organs.
and also the pericardium, which is a layer around the heart. Okay, a layer of tissue around the heart. These are all locations. And so we have a function. So we're going to resist stress in multiple directions. So strong attachment, but resisting in multiple directions rather than a single direction for dense irregular connective tissue. And we can take a look at that. So here they're using the example of the reticular region of the dermis. So again, we're going to talk about this in the next chapter, which is the integumentary system. That's our skin. So we have the epidermis, which is in white here, and then in blue is the dermis. And this is subdivided into two regions. One of those regions is the reticular region, and that has this dense irregular connective tissue. And if you imagine the skin is always being pulled in many directions as you use your body. So it is perfect for that kind of functionality. And as you can see, we have fibers running in multiple directions here. So that's dense irregular connective tissue. Then we have elastic tissue. And here we have dense elastic tissues, or elastic fibers, I should say. And some of the locations where we find this type of tissue is in the lungs, in the walls of elastic arteries, the trachea, which is your windpipe, okay? Bronchial tubes, which branch off of the trachea. Okay. And what this is, the function of this is it allows stretching. And also has this elastic quality, so it's acting like a rubber band. It stretches and then can spring back to its original shape after being stretched because of the elastic fibers that we find in it. So let's take a look at an example here. And yeah, perfect. They're using the aorta as an example. This is an elastic artery. So we have muscular arteries and elastic arteries, and this is definitely an elastic artery. You'll learn the difference between those when you get into 40B. Right now, just by the name of it, elastic artery, it's just like a giant rubber band because it has all of this elastic tissue making up the wall of this artery. So what happens is this: the heart contracts, the lower two ventricles contract together, pushing blood. The left ventricle pushes blood into this artery, which is called the aorta, and the right one pushes it into the lungs. So this would also be a artery that filled with it's called the pulmonary trunk, but it also has elastic tissue in it. But let's focus on the aorta. So when the heart pumps blood into this vessel, the walls of that vessel literally expand out like this, like if you were stretching a rubber band. And then the heart relaxes. The ventricles relax, and as they're filling with blood, there's a moment when they're not contracting, of course, because they're relaxed, and these chambers are filling with blood again, getting ready for the next contraction. So when that happens, there's no pressure from the heart in the system. But as you know, if you're taking blood pressure, you always have two measurements, a high measurement and a lower measurement, systolic over diastolic.
And okay, so systolic is the higher pressure, 120, let's say. That's when the heart is contracting and forcing blood into the arteries, and we get that spike in pressure. But then when the heart relaxes, we're going to get a drop in pressure, but it doesn't drop to zero, and it doesn't drop to zero because of these elastic arteries. You've stretched that rubber band, and now the heart relaxes, and that rubber band wants to press back against the stretching, and it pushes against the blood that's in that artery, and it is acting as a kind of secondary pump to keep pressure in the system. So the heart contracts, the artery expands, the heart relaxes, and the artery slowly returns. Then it pumps again, and it slowly returns, and it pumps again, and it slowly returns. And that maintains blood pressure and continues or keeps the flow of blood through the system. So systolic and diastolic pressures, one being the heart contraction and one pressure being the pressure that's produced by these elastic arteries. And they are doing that because of all of these elastic tissue that we see in that type of tissue. So that's elastic connective tissue. Okay. Now we're going to get into cartilage. So cartilage is composed of a network of collagen and elastic fibers. Okay. The ground substance is chondroitin sulfate. I'm only listing a few of the ingredients that make up ground substance, but there's more than this. But chondroitin sulfate gives you resilience. And there are some other chemicals, but chondroitin sulfate is one of the major ones. And it is surrounded or encased in a covering, which is the perichondrium. Okay. Peri means around. Chondrium refers to cartilage, so around the cartilage. And as you know, this is dense irregular connective tissue. So hyaline cartilage is one type. And this has that bluish white color or purplish color. And its location is the nose, the ends of ribs, ends of long bones, and parts of the larynx and trachea, as well as bronchial tubes. Okay. For hyaline cartilage, the function of that material, of that connective tissue, is to provide a surface for movement. That would be at the ends of long bones. And also flexibility, and support. Witness the nose.
Okay. So let's take a look at this. This is the only cartilage that we looked at in the lab, and so by now you should be fairly familiar with this. And here we go. And we can do that over then. There you go. So this is typical for cartilage. And here's my perichondrium. This is dense irregular connective tissue. And then we have the cartilage and the lacuna in which the cells, and notice the terminology here, chondrocyte. So that's the mature form of the cell. It's trapped. It's maintaining this material, and these cells were chondroblasts when the material was originally being laid down. Once they become trapped and are residing inside these little spaces, the lacuna, then we call those chondrocytes. Okay. Fibrocartilage. Here we have dense collagen fibers. So a lot of collagen fibers, as opposed to just not as dense concentration of collagen fibers. No membrane. No, we don't have the perichondrium surrounding the cartilage. Some locations. Pubic symphysis. And we'll talk about that when we look at the bones. We'll find that and recognize where that is. That's where the two hip bones come together in the center of your body, in the front of their body, I should say. Intervertebral discs. So this is the disc in between vertebrae, and some cartilage pads in some joints, such as the knee joint. Okay. Its function is support and fusion, meaning we're joining things together. An example of that would be the pubic symphysis. We're gluing the two bones together with this type of material. Strength and rigidity. It's a very rigid, strong material. Okay. It is the strongest type of cartilage. It is the strongest type of cartilage. So let's take a look at this. Alrighty, get this right. Here we go. All right, so this is fibrocartilage, dense, and you can actually see the fibers. So high density of collagen fibers. So, fibrocartilage. Elastic cartilage. So here we have a high density of elastic fibers. High density of elastic fibers. And location, the ear something called the epiglottis. Now, if you've never heard of that term, epiglottis, you can at least figure out something about it, because what does epi mean? It means above. So whatever this thing is, it's sitting above this other thing called the glottis. So you're going to run into that when you do the respiratory system. This is structures, closes off the airway when you swallow food or liquid. So it's called the epiglottis, and it's composed of elastic cartilage. And one other place, the auditory tubes. And the auditory tubes is a small tube, one for each ear, that opens up in the throat and goes to the middle ear. And what that tube is designed to do is to help you equalize pressure on either side of the eardrum. So when you are traveling, like you're flying or you're going up a mountain or coming down a mountain, and you do that to equalize the pressure, what you're doing is you're opening up that auditory tube and allowing air to flow from the mouth, the throat, into the middle ear, so that the pressure on each side of the eardrum is exactly the same. So as you go up the mountain, pressure is being released because you're getting higher elevation. There's less pressure, less air pressure, and you want the air pressure across the eardrum to be equal. So you have this little tube that allows you to do that. This is the tube that often gets, it's a very small tube, and particularly in babies. So this is one of the reasons they have a really hard time equalizing pressure when they are flying. For example, I had a really hellacious experience with my first daughter, Kelly. We were flying back from Hawaii, and we had a full plane. And she could not equalize that pressure. She was just screaming in pain for hours. And I was walking around the airplane. This was before 9/11, of course. A lot more freedom to go do things. And I was holding her and trying to calm her down. It was a long flight. Finally did it, and she calmed down and went to sleep. And I don't think she ever remembered that. I have asked her about it. She says she has no memory of it. I do. Anyway, location, ear, epiglottis, auditory tubes. What is the function? I'm tired. Function is support and flexibility. Oh, that's spelled wrong. That's all right. I don't care anymore. All right. There you go. So, I think that's going to end this session 4. We have a little bit left. That will be session 5, and that will finish off the chapter. So let's call it a day, and I'll see you in session 5.